Welcome, everybody. This is the Department of Internal Medicine Grand Rounds, the first of this year. Today is September 14th. So I'm going to introduce the speaker here in a minute, but just for folks online, the CE credit code will be available shortly. And those in the audience here, you should be able to text the code in as well. But hope everybody saw the flyer. We have an exciting program for the fall for lots of different topics to cover. So if you ever have any feedback or questions, feel free to let us know. As a reminder, we are in a hybrid format here in person in the George Ben Johnston Auditorium or virtual online every Thursday from 12 to 1 o'clock. So, all right, let's go ahead and introduce our speaker and let's get started. So today's session is sponsored by the department. We have a external speaker to the department, Jodi Koste, who is a associate professor emeritus from the VCU libraries and also the former university archivist. Jodi Koste holds a Bachelor of Art and a master's degree in history from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. She has spent 45 years in various positions here at VCU, including the University Archivist at the VCU Health Sciences Library. An active professional, she spent 12 years serving as the Executive Secretary for the American Association for the History of Medicine, as well as roles with the Society of American Archivists and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. Her research interests include institutional history, history of nursing, and archival education. I believe Jodi is also retiring, I think this year, or has retired, and has been instrumental in a number of projects that the health system has researched in terms of history over the last decade or 2 decades. So thank you for everything that you've done, and we're looking forward to an exciting presentation. Welcome, Jodi, up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making time in what I know is a very busy schedule to come and learn a little institutional history. We hope.
The code will be available at the end of the presentation again, but if you want to take a picture of something of it now, feel free to do so. Thanks.
I'd like to begin with these 2 quotes from a medical historian to remind us why we are here today. What you'll hear about is very troubling and a lot to contemplate. The situation is not necessarily unique to this medical center, but is experiences that have occurred at other medical centers across the country. So we'll begin with a rather idyllic photo here. This is an artist's depiction of Richmond in the 1830s. The decade of the 1830s saw the rise of many new medical schools, as you see by the number 30, that were created before 1840. And in that group of 30 was this medical school. Richmond actually was changing from the way that the artists depict Richmond in that earlier image, and was very much becoming an industrial town, morphing into a city with significant iron works and milling that was taking place here. Tobacco would make its appearance in the second half of the 19th century. But the most significant thing about Richmond was that it was the largest slave trading center in the Upper South, and significantly marked the history of the city, and still does to this day, its legacy. And you can see that legacy here. You're looking at the former Lumpkin slave jail, and you can see the medical center clearly in the background. So right near to all the activity related to slavery was the beginning of this medical center. So the school actually began as the medical department of Hampton-Sydney College, opening in November of 1838. You notice the anatomy iconography that's on the lecture tickets that students would purchase in order to come to school here. It was easier to start an institution by hooking onto an existing institution that already had a charter, and so that's what the founders of the school chose to do. One of the reasons, again, then they even advertised this in their catalog, is they came here because there were opportunities to procure bodies for dissection, as well as having patients for infirmary, where they could again teach and instruct students in medicine and surgery. The primary mover behind the medical school was this man, Dr. Augustus Warner. He spent 3 years in Charlottesville as the professor of anatomy and surgery, but found it frustrating to deal in such a small university town. There were not nearly enough patients, nor were cadavers for dissections easily obtained. And so when he started the medical school in Richmond, he immediately advertised in the local newspapers, as you see on the right, with an advertisement from December of 1838, where he's appealing to the owners or the enslavers and those that hired the enslaved to consider the school for their enslaved individuals who may need medical care. You may not know mostly what we learn in high school about the institution of slavery relates to its role in agriculture. But Richmond had approximately, at the time that the school was founded, about 8,000 enslaved individuals, and many of these were hired from other further rural areas and were in the city. So there were a fair number of enslaved individuals that supported the thriving and growing industrial base here in Richmond. The school first started in the upper right-hand corner in an old hotel building, the Union Hotel, that was fitted out to be a medical school. Obviously, since it wasn't designed for that purpose, there were a lot of things that they had to improvise. They actually did run an infirmary. They had the support of enslaved individuals that served as orderlies and in other roles to help keep the school moving along. In 1844, they moved to the Egyptian building, which you know is here still on campus, and the school has then been here ever since the fall of 1844. The Egyptian building was designed specifically for medical education. It included an infirmary, classrooms, and of course an anatomical dissection area that was on the top level so that it could take advantage of the skylights that were initially in the building to provide light. The faculty, of course, would use experimental treatment methods, experimental surgery, as they attempted to care for patients, both white and free Black and the enslaved. Early on, when medical literature started here in Virginia in the early 1850s, they would publish their findings, including sometimes a few images of what they had undertaken here at the school. In 1854, the school broke away from Hampton-Sydney and secured from the Virginia General Assembly their own charter and became the Medical College of Virginia, which of course people still refer to as MCV, and I will probably lapse into that a little bit as we get more in the modern era, instead of course, the official name VCU Health. Many people in the community, however, were aware of the kinds of things that went on here. They understood that people could receive care here. This was a time then, if at all possible, you were cared for at home. People had a tendency to look at hospitals as almshouses, and they tried to avoid them. But for many of the enslaved who were hired from a rural area, they had no family or support system here, so they literally had no choice. In the late 1850s, there was talk of establishing a marine hospital here. Hard to think about Richmond being a port, because of course we know it today, but at this particular time of the 19th century, you could navigate the James River up to Richmond, where the fall line was. And so there was talk of developing a marine hospital because, again, the medical school could support in providing care. So in the course of dialogue about this in the newspaper, this particular article pointed out the fact that there was fear among the sailors that might come here for their care, that if they passed away, they might end up in the dissecting room. And this kind of rumor or acknowledgement of what happened at the medical school was pretty pervasive, because the medical school actually had to take out an advertisement, as you see here on the right, indicating that they did not move patients who passed away directly to the dissecting room, but that in every case they were decently interred in the public burying grounds. And the man that you see on the left is the dean of the medical school at the time. Well, while they may have been decently interred initially, we do know a little bit about the practices of obtaining cadavers during the 19th century. And this story didn't fully unfold until April of 1994, when the university was digging for foundations for the Contos Medical Sciences building, just a little bit to the east of us here. And they discovered a well that contained human remains. And these remains date from the antebellum period and were the result of the custodian in the anatomy lab dumping the human remains in the lab once they were no longer usable or serviceable in the anatomical lab. So this was a rather frightful chapter of the history that was uncovered in 1994, and we will return to it as we get to the 20th century. The school continued to thrive, although it never really had super large classes in the lead up to the American Civil War. However, they did host a very big class following John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. And with the increased student body, they were able to petition the Virginia General Assembly for additional funds. The General Assembly gave them funds, but made the institution a state institution. The funding that they got erected a new hospital on the site of, again, the Contos Medical Sciences building. And I want to draw your attention to the ad where, again, there are distinctions made between patients of color and white patients, as you see in the pricing that is available for those that are taking advantage of the health services in the infirmary that was associated with the school. Well, next comes the American Civil War, and as many of you know, of course, Richmond was right in the center of things. The image on the right actually dates from April of 1865, post-war, but gives you a feeling for how the medical school was situated in Richmond and how close it was to everything else. What you can't see in this image is that the state capitol is just to the left. And so this positioned the medical school to play a significant role within the medical department of the Confederate States. On the left, you're looking at a document that shows by all the endorsements on the back how it went through the various chains of the Confederate government, starting again at the very top with L.S. Joines, the man you saw just a few minutes ago, and how it passed through the channels as they were trying to obtain a canal boat and some fuel for the medical school. The Civil War gave students a fairly rich experience. They were able to do work at the various hospitals. Richmond became a hospital center. Under the tutelage of the faculty, most all the faculty had a role one way or the other in the Confederate Medical Department. That's James McCaw, who ran the Chimborazo Hospital, and today there's still a Chimborazo Park, and you can learn more about this hospital installation at the National Park Museum that's up there on the hill. On the left is Simon Baruch, who graduated in 1862 and immediately went into the Army to serve as an assistant surgeon. Well, after the war, Richmond was in difficult times. A good portion of the city was burned by the retreating Confederates. The medical school was not burned. However, some federal troops did come through and destroy some of the equipment in the Egyptian building. But thankfully, that was all the damage that it sustained. So the school reopened. Amazingly, there were some people that could actually pay and come. But the school realized that there was an opportunity to create a different kind of dispensary. And if you look on the right at the advertisement, you see here they are advertising their services to indigent patients. And this is kind of the beginning of what we would call the safety net that this institution then became in the healthcare system. So you see an image on the lower left, again, many displaced people of color that had no home, no health care, not much of anything. The Freedmen's Bureau was in town and provided some services and some medical care, again, with the college providing support happened there. Yes. So this is the earliest extant photo we have of the Egyptian building, and there's the old hospital I've been talking about up there on the far right in the photograph. And this image dates probably from about 1867. So this is what it would have looked like in the immediate post-war period. Again, they're advertising the services of the hospital, again, still segregated with different prices for the different races. Not only was that stressed in the facilities, in the segregated facilities, but it was also the message that was preached by faculty as well. On the screen is Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire, who used to be the namesake of the VA here in Richmond, but that has been changed. He was president of the AMA in 1893. However, he had very strong views on the races and kind of preaching a eugenics rhetoric. Here, you note what he has to say about African Americans. That continued for quite some time. You see an article again about someone affiliated with the school talking about race and tuberculosis, and even later on about urinary incontinence. So a long legacy here about the difference in medicine and race. So during the latter part of the 19th century, Virginia as a whole starts to develop what we have now know as Jim Crow and Jim Crow laws. But the biggest factor was the Constitution of 1902 that disenfranchised most African Americans and also specified that the two races could not be educated together. And that, of course, would have a major impact on this institution here. So the institution got a brand new hospital in 1903. It's still standing on the corner of 12th and Broad Street, so you can see it today. The Virginia Department of Transportation lives there. But this was its first modern hospital, opening right as you see, just a few years into the 20th century. This building housed all the patients. However, people of color were relegated to the basement, while white patients had the option of private rooms that were on the right-hand side as you look at this image, as well as several ward facilities in this building that was the teaching hospital for the institution. Some in Richmond society, especially those that considered themselves progressive, felt that the basement of the Memorial Hospital was an inadequate place for people of color to receive care. And so they embarked on a fundraising campaign that was interrupted by the U.S.'s involvement in World War I. But finally, they were able to erect the St. Philip Hospital. And as you see by the image that comes from a contemporary published work, it was listed as the hospital for colored patients. On the left is the architect's rendering of the building and then actually how it was built out. Eventually, it opened in 1920. So the school then had a number of different facilities, which they always advertised and listed them as to what race could go to what facility, as you note from the advertisement on the left. What I always find interesting is the one on the right, which indicates the care and treatment of patients without regard to race, creed, or color, yet they were all put into separate facilities, all of which were not equal. So in this particular time, and some of you may know from your experiences in healthcare, if you had a hospital, you needed a nursing school because it was the nursing students who provided the care in the hospital. There was a RN that usually served as the head medical or surgical nurse, but the rest of the nursing students or rest of the nursing care was provided by nursing students. And so when the St. Philip Hospital was open, MCV, even though it had its own nursing school, had to create a separate school. Remember that Constitution of 1902. They had to establish a separate school for African American women, and they created the St. Philip School of Nursing in 1920 when the hospital opened. And it continued in existence as, again, a separate facility until 1962. Now, there were many growing number of African American healthcare practitioners, physicians, as you see in this group picture here. However, they could not practice in the St. Philip Hospital, although there were African American nurses and nursing students. None of the physicians were African American. The college did periodically host what they called a postgraduate clinic, where they would invite the African American practitioners from the city of Richmond to come in and have some continuing education. But in order to practice here, you had to have be on the faculty, and they were not going to be admitted to the faculty. So the only people of color that were seen at the medical school were the orderlies, the cooks, the janitors, and others. The clinics were also segregated. Here you see a waiting room that was the clinic in the 1920s. So you have the white patients on the left and the African Americans on the right. And this continued until MCV built a separate new clinic, which they did, adhering to the doctrine of the land at the time, separate but equal. And you notice in the architect's drawing on the left that there are two waiting rooms that are identical sizes, just divided by the information booth. And this is the way things were in the A.D. Williams Clinic. Today, you can see one of the porticos from the A.D. Williams Clinic on 12th Street. So if you ever walk by and see that piece of an architectural structure, you know it's from this clinic. And many people in our community here associate care at this institution with this clinic. So it resonates with many of them, not always positively. And one of the reasons is, of course, the long lines that patients had to endure in order to be able to get in and see a physician. And here are some images from the 1950s. At the top, you see an old mural. That mural was pulled out when the building was put down, and you can see this in the lobby of the McLaughlin building today. And the story of that mural, there's a panel on the side that gives you the story of that mural. Well, about the same time, we're talking now in the 20s, late teens, and certainly post-World War I and the 20s, a number of the physicians and surgeons associated with the medical school went out and established their own hospitals. So Richmond then became home to all these various private hospitals. But what they could do with these private hospitals is they could pick and choose what patients they choose to treat. And so again, it just amplified then MCV's role as the safety net, because these private hospitals did not want to treat the indigent. And to give you an idea of what things used to be like, on the left is a graphic showing what an average day was like. Take a look at the very top where it says 777 inpatients at the time. Of course, this was a different era than today. And then the various services, what's going on. But also look on the right, and that's statistics from the clinic. And notice the numbers for the two races and how many more people of color were treated here than white patients. Another chapter that we need to talk about from the 20th century, dark chapter, of course, is the concept of eugenics. And eugenics was taught at medical schools across the country, but definitely at this one. In fact, the man that you see on the screen, Walter Plecker, is the one that taught the eugenics here at MCV. He was involved, as were other physicians, in the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924, where the race or color of an individual needed to be recorded with the Bureau of Vital Statistics, which, of course, he was head of that bureau for some time. And you see from the quote that the registrar is responsible for ensuring that no trace of colored blood in anyone offering to register as a white person. So this was very, very harmful. By the course of this, he pretty much eliminated all designation as Native American, and it has certainly taken almost the last 100 years to reestablish that, and for the Native American communities here in Virginia to be able to be federally recognized again as Native American. So a lot of harm done by this man, very much a segregationist and eugenics proponent. But even worse is probably this man, Dr. Joseph D. Jarnett, a graduate here of this institution, went on to be in charge of the Western State Hospital, which was a mental health care facility. He was instrumental in forming the Lynchburg colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded. Also was responsible for the legislation or contributed to the sterilization law, the Racial Integrity Act. And then if you really want to know his views, read his doggerel verse on the far right-hand side, and you'll understand where he is coming from. And so there was a famous case here in Virginia that upheld Virginia's sterilization law, and that was the sterilization of Carrie Buck. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, known as Buck v. Bell. And under that law, then Virginia then involuntarily sterilized more than 8,000 individuals, and this continued into the 1970s before finally Virginia then outlawed it. So in addition to, of course, racial segregation, there was segregation when it came to the genders. And women, while of course were in the nursing program, were barred from being in any of the other programs. As the U.S. became involved in World War I, there was a great need for healthcare workers. And so the Board of Visitors of MCV decided, okay, as a war expedient, we will admit women to all the programs, pharmacy, medicine, and dentistry. First woman to graduate was the woman you see on the screen. She was a transfer student from the University of Toronto and was here 2 years and graduated in 1920. They would then advertise on the front page of the catalog, as you see there, men and women admitted on equal terms. So maybe they were admitted on equal terms, but not everything was equal. So on the screen is Mary Bauman, a graduate of the 1922 class, and she was to serve an internship at the Memorial Hospital. However, when she arrived, she learned that she was not to be paid because women were considered volunteers, while male interns were being paid. She would have none of it. She was an older student. She graduated, I think, at about age 44. She'd have none of it. She fought the authorities and finally established that women interns should be paid as well. So as you heard, the Constitution said that the two races could not be educated together. So that meant it was going to be a long time before those walls would come down. I'm sure you all are familiar with Brown versus the Board of Education. That was a later step. There were actually several Supreme Court cases before then that made the doors for higher education open. And so on the screen are some of the pioneers in the various programs who came here. It was a very difficult time because although they were admitted into the educational program, all of the infrastructure on campus was not supportive of integration. So they couldn't go to the various local restaurants that sprinkled the campus at the time. They couldn't live in the dormitories, so there were a lot of issues. So it was a very rough road for all of these individuals. The first one to graduate was this woman, Dr. Jean Harris, and her whole time here was followed in the newspaper. And then, as you see, she received an internship at the Memorial Hospital and made the cover of Ebony magazine. So although this was accomplished in the late 50s, going into the early 60s, all was still not well. In 1962, this man, Dr. Charles Christian, who was a Korean War graduate and #1 in the medical school class, was not invited to all of the graduation dance and social activities that had historically and traditionally accompanied graduation for MCV students. And it created quite a stir. The faculty was somewhat different in 1962 than it may have been in the 50s or the 40s. Faculty signed a petition and said that this should not happen any longer. And eventually more of the barriers started to come down. But a big motivation for barriers coming down was this legislation, the Medicare bill, as you see Lyndon Johnson signing it into effect in 1965. And the federal government said, now that they had a big stick, that integrate or you're not going to get any federal funding. And so that was of concern to the institution for sure. So with the Office of Civil Rights, who was responsible for overseeing all of this, MCV finally takes some steps to integrate its hospitals. And so they kind of did it overnight. If you read this short news article on the left, effective today, all room assignments will come from 2 central offices, one for private patients and one for staff patients, rather than from offices separated by race. However, they kind of just changed terms, and most of the staff patients were African American, while private patients were white. So I want to move on and talk a little about our physical environment here. So again, you can understand the impact of those changes on the institution. Again, you see our Egyptian building, and where the arrow is the Egyptian building. But look, this is again 1865. Look at the natural topography here, and you see neighborhoods all around. Well, this, of course, has changed significantly since 1865. In fact, there was a lot of buildup even before then. This is a picture from about 1913 to get your bearings. This is our neighbor here, the White House of the Confederacy. So you can see this is a lot of slum housing that's right next to the medical center at this time. In addition, Broad Street was no great shakes either. Some of the buildings that you see along here comprise part of Richmond's red light district. So not real estate that people wanted to invest in. The college worked very cleft with the city, who of course was doing a lot of planning and moving into the phase of urban renewal. The map you see on the left is from a master plan. The dark areas indicate where there is majority African Americans living. And so this worked nicely with what some of the university plans were, because they recognized that some of the land was going to be available much cheaper. You may have heard of the concept of redlining, where you couldn't get federal money to insure your mortgage if you were African American or living within a red line district. All of that plays into the history of the institution as well. This is the corner of 12th and Clay, where I spent my time in the Health Sciences Library before the Health Sciences Library was built. So again, because there was no great clamor, the college was able to purchase some of this property for a lower cost because it was valued less, so they could continue their expansion. So here you see the school about 1942 in the midst of World War II, the Egyptian building, West Hospital, right next door here, is shiny and new in the middle, but you can kind of see by the color of the buildings what the new construction is, and it's all consolidated in this area. But if you look around, you can still recognize along this coast here, known as Bacon's Quarter Branch, you could still kind of recognize the topography from that 1865 photograph that we saw. But also notice that there's a lot of residential areas still around the medical school. And that was going to be changing. And one of the big changes occurred when the planning and the implementation of what was the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, now Interstate 95, happened. And you can see that the turnpike just cut this huge swath through the historically Black neighborhood of Jackson Ward and Navy Hill. So big change brought with the creation of Interstate 95. It also created some changes right here at the medical center. Conveniently, an exit was made right here at Broad Street so people could get right to the medical center. This opened up some land, and so the college again took the opportunity to purchase it whenever it could. This was a series of dormitories that was on this particular plot of land from 1960 until about 5 years ago. You can see in the background, it's still residential. This is the last part of Navy Hill. The state borrowed land from MCV to put up a Civil War Centennial Center. Again, as kind of an insult. This was on land that was Navy Hill, historically African-American neighborhood. And when the Civil War Centennial was over with, the building then reverted to the medical college and was used as a student center until it was torn down and replaced with the current Lyric Center that we use today. So this is a fairly contemporary image. It's probably about 6 or 7 years old now, but you see the little old Egyptian building, but you see how the school has just filled up every square inch of land, and you're hard pressed to see a house anywhere because they all have been obliterated from the landscape. And there's our original picture again, so you can follow around to the Bacon's Quarter branch. Again, see Interstate 95 intersecting things, and how so much space that was once occupied by people's homes is now gone and occupied by the medical center or other parts of state government. So moving on, another factor is, of course, the institution did engage in research beginning back in the 19th century, but that geared up in the 20th century, and particularly following World War II, when this man, Dr. Everett Evans, who was a member of the Department of Surgery, had a number of federal grants to take a look at burns. And this is, again, the nuclear age, the atomic age. And so he, at the request of the federal government and with funding from the federal government, is looking into this and conducting research on that. So that meant that he was doing some testing in humans. At the time, there was not the same standards for dealing with humans in research projects. And so he had volunteers from here, medical students, as well as students from Virginia Union University, historically Black university here in town, that were patients or volunteers for his experiments to take a look at flash burns. This was publicized. It was both in the medical literature and in the local press. But in the 1990s, when there was a lot of investigation in the use of radiation and other experiments that went on during the 1950s and early 1960s, environmental activists and anti-nuclear activists publicized a op-ed piece where he accused the school of running a secret metabolic lab, and indicating that most of the patients were poor and African American. So clearly created a huge PR problem for the institution. Yes, patients were involved in a study that they wouldn't be today, but they were done in the standards of the time. Speaking of the 1950s, in the 1950s, this man, Dr. David Hume, came from Harvard to be chair of the Department of Surgery. He's looking down on us now. That's his portrait up there. And he was quite the dynamic individual, had been involved in early transplant work at Harvard before he came to Richmond. He did a transplant of kidneys between identical twins in the 1950s to kind of kick off transplant surgery here at MCV. And he also, again, as times were different, was seeking convict donors as well as others in the period where they didn't have the technology that we have today that has allowed us to expand the donor pool somewhat. And he recruited this man, Dr. Richard Lauer, had been working out at Stanford University with Norman Shumway, doing the pioneering work on heart transplant. And here they are in their animal lab here at MCV. And he then went on to do the first heart transplant at MCV in May of 1968. Unfortunately, again, different standards for the time, they took a heart from an African-American man and transplanted it into this man here that you see on the right without securing permission from his family. The family then filed a court suit. The family was represented by, at the time, State Senator L. Douglas Wilder, who, of course, you all recognize from our VCU Wilder Center, as well as he was a former governor and serves on the faculty currently. So the surgical team was charged with wrongful death. At the time, the jury of 7, all male, all white, acquitted the doctors. In the part, I guess one of the contributions is that they had juries and the legal system thinking about this concept of brain death, and subsequently brain death legislation was passed here in Virginia. So 1968 is a watershed for many reasons because the institution changes one final time. You see the evolution from Hampton-Sydney to MCV to finally Virginia Commonwealth University, and there's the governor signing in the legislation that created the university. So new times, new era, but many things were still the same. These are photos from the main hospital in the 1980s showing that everyone you see, nurses, students, interns, are all white. If you wanted to see people of color, they were found in the same places as those working in the cafeteria, those cleaning, those working in the record office, all the less paying menial, clerical, and other jobs here at the school. This whole legacy was brought to light again not that long ago when the governor, Ralph Northam, took heat for his photograph in his college yearbook. And that prompted us to undertake an audit of the yearbooks here at MCV. And notice as late as 2008, images are appearing of students in blackface. So the legacy is deep and definitely runs long. But there is some positive news as we wind up. In 2020, the institution took the step of decommissioning various names that were associated with the Confederacy. And so the landscape changed with plaques coming down, names being changed, and other changes at the institution. The bones that were the human remains that were discovered in 1994, although an article appeared in 1994, had been largely forgotten. Interest was revived again with Dr. Sean Utsi of VCU's psychology department developed the film Until the Well Runs Dry, and that brought community attention to this issue again, and nothing that was done back at the time of the discovery. And so through a series of community events, a family representative council was created that you see here. And since 2013, they have guided the university in their work with the human remains. They had spent a long time at the Smithsonian Institution where they were initially analyzed, but then in November of 2019, they were brought home to Richmond. And recently, additional DNA testing has been done, and now we will move into the phase of appropriate memorialization of these human remains. If you want to learn a little bit more about it, there is a temporary exhibit until permanent memorialization can be done that's in the Contos building to let all medical students who start school here and often are meeting in that auditorium an opportunity to understand what happened here, that they're actually on hallowed ground when they're in the Contos Medical Sciences building because they are on human remains. Here, the Board of Visitors then, when they voted to decommemorate everything, and you see the facilities team here taking down and making changes to the landscape here on campus. Last year, the last academic year, the common book, the book that all incoming freshmen read, was The Organ Thieves, written by a local author. And it tells the story of the first heart transplant and the stolen heart from Bruce Tucker, used in the very first transplant operation. And if you only read one thing, I recommend that you read this book. It gives you a good feel for the recent history of this medical institution. And I think it's very important for dealing with the community today to understand their perspective and where some of them come from. And finally, when you have an opportunity, check out the History and Health website. They have a number of different recordings that, again, explore a lot of issues related to the historical legacy of this institution. And again, with that, I will be happy to take any questions that you have. And I will leave it on this screen so you can see the QR code for your CME credit. Questions, both virtual audience or here?
Thank you. We can begin, open it up here for questions.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. When you were talking about eugenics, how were they able to identify or trace that there was no Black blood in
It was how the registrar reported it. So formally, the law was that if you were one, oh, sorry. Yes, repeat the question. They wanted to know how, during the period of eugenics, how did a registrar know that there was one drop of African-American blood? Before that law, if you were 1/16th African-American, which meant you had a great-great-grandparent who was African-American, then you were put in that category. But now it became arbitrary. It could be what the registrar said, either by rumor, innuendo, they not like the look of the way the family that was reporting the birth or whatever, then you could get classified that way. And so instead of a system that recognized Native Americans, African Americans, and whites, they chose two, African American or white. So that's how the Native American population kind of got pushed out. Other questions?
Anyone else here in person? I have multiple thank yous.
Okay.
Online, but no immediate question. I have a question. We have a lot of clinicians, obviously, in the audience, and how would you recommend, approaching the historical perspective of MCV and the history of what we've been through in daily patient encounters? Do you have any guidance or advice for us?
The question is, how do clinicians approach patients with the knowledge of this legacy? That's a tough one. I mean, I think it gives you an understanding. You might now know why there is an element of distrust when you're dealing with a patient because they've had to live through this. And even if they didn't live through this, they had a family member, parent, or a grandparent that lived through this and passed those stories along. So it's definitely a difficult one. I think it's one where you need a lot of understanding and knowing that you're going to have to maybe work even harder to obtain the trust of the patient that you're working with.
Questions?
On maybe things I left out that you want to know about? Yes.
Since you're retired, how does this information get imparted to incoming?
Well, the History and Health Initiative that I mentioned, they have a whole steering committee, and I'm serving on that steering committee. And Medicine has incorporated some of this into orientation. And so we're looking about how we can do this across the medical center. So there are some resources online that if you know about them, you can go and look at them. But we're trying to be more deliberate and proactive about getting this message out there, and not just for incoming students. I mean, it needs to be for everybody. It needs to be for house staff. It needs to be for employees in the health system, all, so they understand.
Excellent.
Thank you. I can't believe there are more questions. You're welcome.
We'll be available if anybody has any other questions.
Yes.
Thank you so
yes,
much.
Thanks.